Hi, I'm Robert Mintz, Deputy Director here at the Asian Art Museum. I'm really glad you can join me today. We're going to take a small tour of some of the smallest things in the museum collection. They are some of my favorites, and I want to show you why they spark my imagination. Today, we're going to be walking around in the Aina and Atsuhiko Tateuchi Japan galleries, and I'm going to show you works from the 18th and the 19th centuries. The objects I'm going to show you today are some of the smallest in the museum's collection. These objects are called Netsuke. They're Japanese carved toggles, the ends of little pouches that would have been hung from a man's belt. So during the 18th and 19th century, these little toggles that sort of button up at the top, the Netsuke, were used by men to hold this pouch in place. So when they went out of their home, they wanted to carry small items with them. They would take one of these small pouches, fill it with the items, and then tuck that toggle up underneath their sash, their obi, around their traditional costume. Just having an item like that to decorate your attire is something that's not unique to Japan. Of course, we see this around the world. I myself am wearing cufflinks. This one happens to be the little logo of our museum. We do this, and in Japan they did this, and they took it to a kind of adventurous new level. They hired carvers to carve ivory and wood, shell, bone, and exotic materials into fantastic little sculptures. So if you look very closely over here, you'll see an inro with an image of an ox on its surface, and up at the top, a netsuke, also with an ox. And you might think to yourself, well, was this person maybe a farmer? Probably not. It was probably a merchant in the city who was aware that during this particular year, the ox was that Chinese symbol of the zodiac year of the ox. This might be an object that someone would carry just for that year, or perhaps they were born in the year of the ox, and so would remind people of their identity, their persona. In the same way, my cufflinks show you that I work at this museum. I'm going to show you a variety of different netsuke, each one of them telling a different kind of story. And I think the thing to think about as you're looking at netsuke is to think, who would have worn this? Why would they have worn it? And what would the people around them have thought as they saw these tiny little sculptures hanging from the front of each man's belt? Come with me over here. So these are some of the best netsuke in our collection. You can see them arranged here on a variety of little plastic shelves, and you can very quickly understand that these little sculptural pieces tell stories. They show us figures from history, they show us figures from myth, they show us all kinds of interesting subjects. And I want to draw your attention to two netsuke that are down here right beside me. One of them has a man on a horse with an attendant. That's Ariwara no Narihira. Ariwara no Narihira is one of the Six Immortal Poets of classical Japan. He lived a long time ago, back in the 9th century. He was a writer of heroic poetry, and he was famous for being, let's say, the most handsome devil around. He was a knockout, and right next to him is another of the Six Immortal Poets inscribed on a netsuke, an image of a woman sitting on a tatami, sort of raised mat. Her name was Onono Komachi, and in this case, she is the ravishing beauty of her era. She wrote beautiful love poetry. The amazing thing about the round netsuke with Onono Komachi, it has an inscription written in the tiniest little characters. First, it describes who she was. It gives her name, and it explains that she was one of the Six Immortal Poets and explains some of the works that she created. If you turn the netsuke over, then you find her poetry. And you can read the poetry of Onono Komachi if you have a magnifying glass. It's extremely small. But you can imagine this being worn on a man's belt, a man who is clearly cultured, clearly well-read, and who knows the classics. Onono Komachi and Ariwara no Narihira are here presented together because they both are part of this sort of literary constellation of important figures. They were the poetry that every learned and, let's say, high-class Japanese merchant, Japanese member of society, urban dweller, would want to have proudly displayed on their belt. There's a wonderful little Netsuke here. If you look very closely, you'll see there's a child leaning, he's sort of on his hands and knees, with one elbow down and a writing brush, a calligraphy brush in his hand. And he appears to be writing on a leaf. There's a leaf that's right underneath him. And then in his other hand, you can see there's a chrysanthemum blossom. Now, seeing those three things, a chrysanthemum blossom, a big leaf, and a tiny child with a calligraphy brush, all of the people in, let's say, Kyoto in 1800 would have said, I know who that is. That's Kikujido. Kiku means chrysanthemum, and Jido is sort of the immortal chrysanthemum boy. There's a story that a long time ago in China, an emperor gave to Kikujido a calligraphy brush and told him to go out and write the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is, of course, a Buddhist text. It talks about the important tenets of Buddhism. And Kikujido very dutifully copied the Lotus Sutra onto a chrysanthemum leaf. And all of you who have chrysanthemums at home, you know how small chrysanthemum leaves are. So Kikujido is very small. But he transcribed this sacred text onto the leaf. And then when the dew fell on the leaf in the morning, he drank a little bit of that dew. And it allowed him to live for 700 years. So he became an immortal. He became a kind of hero of longevity. One of the things that Netsuke often do is they convey this idea of a wish, a hope. So as you're getting older, I'm now in my mid-50s, I'm starting to think about wanting to have more time, as opposed to thinking about how much time has gone by. And so having something that really signifies or symbolizes longevity would be very desirable for somebody like me. Of course, I might also give it to my mother. I might give it to my father. I might give it to somebody who's older than me in hopes that they would live a very long life as well. Another favorite of mine, you see this little figure sitting on the shelf up here. This little figure is kind of a good luck figure. On his sleeve, you can see the character for good fortune, in this case, fuku, written right about where his elbow would be. He's the kind of sculpture that one would see typically in a restaurant in Japan, in a tea house. Many people saw him in brothels. He would sit there on the shelf, and he was a figure that was meant to just sort of greet you and to convey the idea of good luck. Good luck for the merchant, good luck for the patron who's coming into the store. What makes this one special is he's actually a very early form of a bobblehead. You know bobblehead dolls. You go to the baseball park and you get your bobblehead Derek Jeter kind of bobbling along. The same thing happens with this figure. He's an example of a kind of what we call trick Netsuke. A Netsuke that has a kind of playful, funny, animated component. His head is actually suspended. It's on a separate little piece, and it has a tiny string that ties it in place. And if you shake the doll, his head nods back and forth. You can see that his head is really quite white. It's been rubbed many times by the person who wore this Netsuke. Seeing that kind of wear is something that becomes very popular amongst people who collect these. You know, Netsuke, they were a part of attire, just like cufflinks are a part of attire, but over time, as Japanese people during the 19th century began to wear Western-style dress, Netsuke became less necessary. But an audience for Netsuke grew outside Japan. People began to collect them here in the United States. They also collected them in Europe, and Japanese people collected them as sort of historic objects, things that would remind them of the past. This one would have been very popular because it's very clearly been used. It really played a role. Other Netsuke in this case may have been made simply for that collecting trade. Let's move a little further along in the case here because I have some other images to show you. So if you look right in the middle here, you'll see there's a Netsuke of a tiny puppy. You might ask yourself, like I said a few minutes ago, what would people have wanted a Netsuke like this for? If it's, of course, those literary figures, poets, we know what they were for. If it's a figure that's wishing longevity. We can understand what that's for. Even the bobblehead that wishes you good luck, we know what that's for. But why would you want, at the end of your little cord that's holding your important objects, or maybe your tobacco pouch, a little tiny puppy? This puppy is a good example of the kind of Netsuke that one would keep either because they had a love of puppies, possibly, or perhaps this is the kind of Netsuke that was made explicitly for the collecting world. Once people have collected a variety of other animals, flora and fauna, if you look next to the puppy, you'll see there's a snake that's strangling a monkey. If you look below the puppy, you'll see that there's a monkey with, I do believe, a lion dog on its back. And if you look next to the puppy, you'll see there's an octopus climbing out of the top of an octopus trap. Those kinds of objects are sort of a cataloging of the natural world. They become sculptural representations of things that people would know from within society, and they're also playful and fun. They're something that people could collect and enjoy. As I said, collecting in the West became popular, so people, like the people who built this collection, gathered these items together to sort of have a catalog or a kind of range of different subject matters. This puppy in particular, if you get a chance to come to the museum and see him, he's incredibly cute. And cuteness is something that starts to appear in Netsuke, particularly in the late 19th century. You start to see many Netsuke made with a kind of humor or kind of lightness to their presentation. Oh, they're happy little things. And as happy little things, you can imagine them both being part of somebody's attire or perhaps also being something that people would just cherish and keep. Way up here in the corner, a gourd. Gourds became very popular in Japanese history. We of course know there are many paintings of gourds, and we have gourds that are used symbolically. It turns out that the name for gourd is homophonous, It sounds the same as some words that are used for good health and for, again, longevity. So gourds become symbolic both because of their long history, but they also become symbolic because they have this sound-like association. Also, gourds, they grow along a vine, and so sometimes in Netsuke, and sometimes in other small works of Japanese art, you'll see a bunch of gourds together, and that's a kind of subtle reference to having lots of children. The idea that you would be very fertile, you would have lots of gourds. You might look up here on this top shelf. You'll see a pomegranate, gourds and pomegranates, and if you look further down, there's a chestnut, and there's some lotus root, and there's a pear that's being eaten by a worm. All of these are just kind of everyday greengrocer vegetables and fruits, things that you would find in your community. But here, the Netsuke carver has taken the advantage of the rare materials that they're using and carved very careful, very precise representations of these various familiar fruits. And of course, each one of them is perfectly ripe, or perhaps even a little bit overripe, so that it would remind people of that sort of richness and abundance that they want to see around them. Down here at the bottom, there's a very strange looking, very fat bird. This is a bird that represents something called the throat-cut sparrow. The story goes something like this. There was this old man, he had a pet. He had a pet sparrow, and he had a very, let's say stern and bitter spouse. Well, one day, he was off working in the farm. So the sparrow was singing to the old man's spouse, and she was so frustrated and so bitter and so stern, she took her knife and she cut the sparrow's tongue out of its mouth. And the sparrow flew out the window, never to be seen again. Well, the old man comes back to his home and he asks, "Where's my sparrow?" And he can see the blood around the house. And he's very sad because he's lost his pet. Months later, he's up on the mountain gathering firewood, and he comes across a sparrow. This is his sparrow. The sparrow had survived and was living on the mountain. So the old man goes with the sparrow to the sparrow's home. And there at the sparrow's home, he meets the sparrow's spouse and the sparrow's children. And the sparrows give him tea, and the sparrows give him cakes, and the sparrows treat him wonderfully. And the sparrows say, oh, before you go, please, we have a gift to give you. The sparrows bring out 2 big baskets. They fill the baskets with gems and with gold and with silver and with wonderful treasures. The man carries the baskets down the hill, and of course his spouse sees this, and she says, wow, where were you? Why didn't you come home? And who cares? Look at what you've brought. The next day, his spouse decides she's going to go climb up the mountain and go talk to the sparrows. So she goes up the mountain. The sparrows welcome her in, and they give her tea, and they give her cakes. She's ready to leave, and the sparrows say, thank you, have a nice day. And she says, oh, but wait. You owe me a gift. And the sparrows think for a minute, we owe you a gift. So the sparrows bring a basket, and they present a basket to the woman. They fill her basket with rocks and send her back down the mountain. Her husband, of course, now is fabulously wealthy and living a wonderful life, and she has nothing to show for her trip to the mountain. And this comes together as a kind of lesson, making sure that you care for the least among your community and realize that the benefits of caring for the least among your community is a benefit that will pay itself back to you over and over again. And yet, if you demand from the least of your community, you get nothing in return. It's one of those kind of Japanese folktale myths that I think everybody would have known in one form or another. Everybody might tell the story a little bit different. But when you see this big fat sparrow hanging from somebody's belt, you know that that's somebody who has that kind of emotional connection to the world in which they help the poor and they benefit through that process of caring for the least around them. Netsuke are the kind of thing that together tell a variety of different and distinct stories. They're ways of communicating symbolically and communicating quickly through images, through legends, through inscriptions, actual words written on their surfaces. In a way, they tell the person who meets you on the street who they've met. They tell you about the personality of the person who's wearing them, and they tell you something about the community within which each of these people lived. When you come to the museum, please join me and take a look at the hundreds of Netsuke that are arrayed here. And also look around for things that might remind you of Netsuke in your own community. If you think about it, you accessorize your outfits, you dress yourself in ways that communicate to the outside, just as the Japanese people of the 18th and 19th century did. It's a subtle kind of game. It's a game of communicating through symbols and through shapes and through stories that I think you'll find very fulfilling.